She had worn his scent for 3 days without knowing it, and every wolf in the great hall had watched her walk past their king with their breath held and their eyes averted, because the truth was written in the air between them, like smoke from a fire neither of them had lit. That was the thing about fate. It did not ask permission. It did not care that Marin was a record keeper, a woman who catalogued the births and deaths and land claims of the Ashvale pack in leather-bound ledgers, a woman whose hands smelled permanently of ink and whose stations sat so far beneath the Alpha King's orbit that she might as well have been invisible. Fate did not care that she had spent 6 years perfecting invisibility, making herself small and quiet and useful in the way that furniture was useful. Fate did not care that she believed, with a conviction as deep and old as the roots under the pack's great stone hall, that she was not the kind of woman whom destiny chose. She was 24 years old, unmarked, and utterly alone in a hall full of people who knew something she did not. The Alpha King's name was Kalen Drovath, and he was the kind of man about whom songs were written not because anyone loved him, but because everyone feared him. He had ruled the Ashvale pack for 11 years, ascending at 17 after his father's death in a border war, and he had spent those 11 years closing himself down like a house shuttered against winter. He was not cruel. Marin had learned that much from the ledgers, from the careful histories she had read. But he was cold in a way that suggested the warmth had once existed and been deliberately extinguished. People called him the Stone King behind his back, and they did not mean it as an insult so much as an observation. You could not be angry at a stone wall for failing to hold you. Marin had catalogued him from a safe distance for all 6 of her years in the hall. She was not foolish enough to do otherwise, and now his scent was on her, and she had no idea how it had gotten there. And every wolf in the great hall was staring at her with the particular careful blankness of people pretending very hard not to stare. It had started 3 days ago, on a Tuesday that had been entirely ordinary up until the moment it was not. She had been moving through the lower corridor with a stack of land claim documents, walking quickly because she always walked quickly, because occupying space too slowly invited questions about why she was there. And she had turned the corner near the Eastern Archive and collided, fully and without grace, with the Alpha King's chest. The documents had scattered. She had stumbled back. He had caught her by the wrist, a reflex, nothing more, and his hand had been warm through the sleeve of her gray wool dress. And the contact had lasted perhaps 4 seconds before he released her and stepped back with a face like carved stone and said nothing at all. She had gathered her papers, apologized to the floor, and fled. She had not thought about it again, or she had tried not to. The warmth of his hand through the wool had followed her to sleep that night, and she had told herself that was a normal response to being touched by a powerful man, and had believed it, mostly. What she had not noticed, what no one had told her, was that 4 seconds of skin-adjacent contact was all it took. What she had not understood was that the mate bond worked not through grand gestures or moonlit declarations, but through something as simple and devastating as a hand on a wrist in a corridor, and that the moment his scent had transferred to her skin, every wolf nose in the pack had registered the truth like a bell struck in a quiet room. The Alpha King had not registered it. He had walked away and gone back to being a stone wall, because whatever the bond had done to him, he had presumably buried it beneath 11 years of practice distance before it could surface. But everyone else knew, and Marin walked through the great hall on that Friday morning with her ledgers and her ink-stained fingers and her determined invisibility, and felt the weight of every averted gaze like a hand pressed against her sternum, and did not understand why the air felt different, why the other packmates cleared space before her in the corridor, why old Sarah from the weaving rooms looked at her as she passed with something that was uncomfortably close to pity. She had no idea. She was the last to know, and the knowing when it came was going to change everything. The record room where Marin spent most of her days was a long, low-ceilinged chamber on the east side of the hall, lined floor to ceiling with shelves of bound ledgers and rolled document cases lit by 4 narrow windows that let in a white winter light which was beautiful in theory and punishing in practice. It was cold in winter, sweltering in high summer, and perpetually smelled of dust and binding glue, and the particular dry paper smell that Marin had come to associate with safety. Nobody came to the record room unless they needed something. Nobody lingered. She had chosen the posting deliberately, 6 years ago, when she had first come to the hall as a newly ranked adult packmate, unclaimed and unaffiliated, and carrying the specific social stigma of being a late-presenting wolf. One whose shift had come at 19 rather than the expected 13 or 14, whose wolf was by all pack convention a sign of weak blood and uncertain status. She had presented her skills in literacy and organization to the old record keeper, Aldrin, and he had taken her on without ceremony. And she had been grateful ever since for the fact that record keeping was considered unglamorous enough that no one had bothered to compete with her for it. When Aldrin had died 2 years ago, she had inherited the role entirely. She was now the sole keeper of the Ashfile Pack's living memory, responsible for every birth record and death notice, every territorial agreement and succession document, every mating registry that the pack produced. She had, in the course of her work, recorded the official documents for every mated pair in the pack over the past 6 years. And she had done so with a careful professional neutrality that she had maintained even when the longing hit her in the chest like something physical. She had never been matched, never felt the pull toward anyone, the way the mated wolves described it. A warmth behind the sternum, a certainty. She had begun to suspect, in the way that she suspected most uncomfortable things about herself, quietly and without drama, that she was simply not the kind of person who got chosen, that her late shift was the first sign, and her unmated status the second, and that the two together were the universe's way of telling her something she did not have the luxury of being devastated about, because devastation required hope, and she had long since made her peace with the absence of it. This morning she sat at the long central table with a new birth record before her, the ink barely dry on the father's signature, and she was filling in the secondary details: date, season, pack district, presiding elder, in her neat, slightly cramped hand, and she was telling herself that today was going to be a completely ordinary day. Old Perrin, from the eastern quarters, came in at 8:30, which was unusual, because he never came to the record room except at quarter days. He was a broad, weathered man in his 60s, one of the senior den fathers, and he stood in the doorway with his hat turning in his hands and looked at Marin with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "Morning, Marin," he said. "Good morning," she said. "Quarter day isn't until the 15th. Is there something you needed?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his hat. Then he looked back at her. "Heard you crossed paths with the king the other day." The phrasing was odd. Crossed paths, not collided with, which was what had actually happened, and which Marin had been mildly embarrassed about for 3 days. "I ran into him in the corridor near the East Archive," she said. "Literally. I dropped my papers. It was not a dignified encounter." "No, I imagine not," Perrin said, and then said nothing else, and went on standing there turning his hat. "Is there something else?" she asked. "How are you feeling?" he said. She set down her pen. "Fine. Why does everyone keep asking me that?" A pause. "Everyone keeps asking. Sarah this morning. Now you." She frowned. "I'm not ill. I'm perfectly well." Perrin made a sound that was not quite words and then said, "You might want to speak to Elder Voss when you have a moment." "About what?" He put his hat back on. "Just when you have a moment," he said, and left. She watched the empty doorway for a beat. Then she picked up her pen and finished the date on the birth record and filed the oddness away with the particular efficiency of a woman who had learned that the best response to things she didn't understand was to keep working. until they clarified themselves. They clarified themselves at noon. She had left the record room to collect a set of signed land documents from the steward's office on the second floor, and she was moving through the central corridor, the wide, formal one that ran the length of the hall and connected the public receiving rooms to the private east wing, when she turned a corner and found herself walking directly toward the Alpha King. He was not alone. He was accompanied by his second, Ryan, and his head advisor, Braith, and two junior packmates, and they were moving with the particular purposeful momentum of men who were going somewhere important. The corridor was wide, but not wide enough for two groups to pass each other without acknowledgement, and Marin did what she always did. She stepped to the side and dropped her eyes and made herself into furniture. He walked past her, or he started to. He stopped. She felt it before she understood it. A change in the quality of the air, a sudden stillness in the group around him, and then the sound of footsteps that should have continued and didn't. She kept her eyes down. She could see his boots, dark leather, stopped 2 feet from her. "You," he said. His voice was not what songs would have you expect from a Stone King. It was low and unremarkable, except for a quality she had never been able to name, which was the sense that whatever he said, he had considered it carefully before he said it, and meant every syllable of it. She had heard him address the full pack twice at Winter Assembly, and both times she had stood in the crowd and felt that voice move through her like cold water. She looked up. His face was exactly as she knew it from 6 years of careful distance, sharp-planed and serious, with dark eyes that gave nothing away, and a jaw that seemed to have been set against something a long time ago and never released. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just solved an equation he had not known he was working on. "You were in the corridor," he said. 3 days ago." "Yes," she said. "I apologize I wasn't looking where I was going. I dropped documents on What's your name?" he said. She blinked. She had worked in his hall for 6 years. "Marin Ashby, my lord. I'm the pack's record keeper." Something moved through his face. Not warmth, not yet, but something she could not name, a subtle shift in the set of his eyes, as though a calculation had just returned a result he had not expected. Behind him, Ryan and Braith were staring at the middle distance with the elaborate neutrality of men who had suddenly discovered something very interesting about the ceiling. "The record keeper," Kaelin said. "Yes, my lord." The silence stretched. She was holding her stack of land documents against her chest with both arms, and she was very aware that she smelled of ink, and that there was very likely a smudge of it on her cheek, and she did not know why the Alpha King had stopped in the middle of the corridor to ask her name, and she did not know why the two men behind him were performing such elaborate indifference, and she was beginning to feel the prickle of something at the back of her neck that was not quite fear and not quite awareness, and she did not have a name for it yet. "Carry on," he said, finally, and moved past her, and the group moved with him, and she stood in the corridor with the documents pressed against her chest and listened to the receding footsteps and felt the prickle spread down her spine like cold water, and thought, for the first time, that something was happening that she did not have a ledger category for. She found Elder Voss that afternoon, or rather, Elder Voss found her, appearing at the record room door at 3:30, with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this moment and was simultaneously glad it had arrived and sorry about the reason. Voss was one of the oldest living wolves in the pack, a small, wiry woman in her 80s with silver hair and the particular authority of someone who had seen enough history that current events rarely surprised her. She had been a midwife, an elder, a keeper of pack law. If there was anyone in the hall who understood the mechanism of mate bonds from a formal perspective, it was her. She sat down across from Merzan at the long table without being invited, which was entirely in character, and she folded her hands on the surface. And she said, "You ran into the king in the east corridor on Tuesday." Everyone knows about that, Marin said. Everyone knows what happened because of that, Voss said carefully. You may not. Marin set down her pen. She looked at the old woman. She waited. Voss said, when a mate bond forms between two wolves, it requires contact to initiate. Not necessarily skin to skin. Proximity and touch, even through clothing, is sufficient if both wolves are the correct pairing. The bond begins as a scent transfer. The one who initiates the contact, who touches first, transfers their base scent to the other. That scent persists for days. Any wolf within range can identify it. The room was very quiet. Outside the narrow windows, the winter afternoon light was going silver-gray with the approach of evening. Marin said, he caught my wrist. Yes, Voss said. That was his hand on my wrist for 4 seconds. Yes, she heard herself say very carefully, and every wolf in this hall has been able to smell that since Tuesday. Yes, child. She stood up from her chair. She did not know why she stood up. She needed to do something with her body that was different from sitting still. She walked 2 steps toward the window and stopped. And the king himself, does he? The origin scent is one's own, Voss said. He would not be able to smell himself on you, not directly. But a wolf knows their own bond eventually. The bond creates its own pull, a warmth, a compulsion toward the other. Marin thought about the corridor this morning, the way he had stopped, the way he had looked at her like he was solving an equation. He doesn't know, she said, or he hasn't let himself know. He is not a man who allows himself much, Voss agreed. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the courtyard was emptying. As evening came on, the packmates moving back toward warmth, and she felt the vast distance between herself and all of them with a clarity that was almost painful. This is a mistake, she said. Whatever the bond thinks it knows, it's wrong. I'm a record keeper. I'm not. I don't have status. I don't have rank. I'm not even a full-strength wolf. My shift came late. My blood is. The bond does not make mistakes, Voss said, with the firmness of someone who had said this before and expected to say it again. Then it made one this time. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, this is not something I can resolve for you. What I can tell you is that the rest of the pack is aware of what's forming between you and the king, and that awareness is going to create pressure on you, on him, and on anyone who has an interest in how this resolves. Marin turned from the window. What kind of interest? The kind, Voss said simply, that comes with 11 years of waiting for a king to take a mate. She went back to her table after the old woman left. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She looked at the half-finished birth record before her with its neat columns and careful notations. And she put the pen down again, and she sat with the knowledge settling over her like snowfall. Slow and total and impossible to stop. She was fated to the Alpha King. The Alpha King did not know it, and everyone else had known for 3 days. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her small room in the East Wing. Record keepers were afforded modest, private quarters, one of the few genuine privileges of the role, and she listened to the sounds of the hall around her, and she thought about the weight of the information she was now carrying and about the particular cruelty of knowing something that was beautiful and impossible in equal measure, because here was the truth that Voss had not said but that Marin understood. A king did not take a record keeper as his mate. Not in the history she had spent 6 years carefully cataloging. Status marriages were complicated things in the pack system, governed by bloodline and strength, and alliances that went back generations. A king's mate was expected to be a wolf of standing, a daughter of a senior den family, a woman with strength and influence and the right to sit beside him at table, not a woman who entered through a side door, who was tolerated rather than respected, who had spent 6 years making herself invisible because invisibility was safer than the alternative. The bond did not make mistakes, Voss had said. Marin, lying in the dark and listening to the hall breathe around her, thought that the bond had perhaps not made a mistake so much, as it had made a choice that the world was not going to accept gracefully, and that the difference between two things was going to matter enormously in the days ahead. She was right. It began the next morning with small things. She was in the record room before dawn, which was usual, and the first unusual thing was that when she went to the kitchens for her morning tea, the three women who were normally indifferent to her presence went conspicuous quiet when she entered, and she felt their eyes on her back as she poured. And when she turned around, all three of them found urgent business elsewhere. It was not hostility exactly. It was more like discomfort. The awkwardness of people who knew something large was coming and did not want to be caught in the middle of it. The second thing was the note. It was slid under her record room door sometime before she arrived, unsigned, written in a hand she did not recognize. It said, "Be careful where you walk. Some corridors are more watched than others." She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket and went back to her ledgers. The third thing was Isolde. Isolde Var was the daughter of the pack's second most senior den father, a tall, fine-boned woman of 27, who had been, by general pack consensus for the past 3 years, the most likely candidate for the Alpha King's eventual mate, not because any formal arrangement had been made, but because she was exactly what a king's mate was supposed to be. Ranked, accomplished, beautiful in the particular restrained way that indicated breeding rather than vanity. And because she had made it quietly clear over those 3 years that she considered the position hers in all but official designation, Isolde came to the record room at 10 in the morning. She came alone, without her usual attendants, which was itself a statement about the nature of the visit. She closed the door behind her, which was another statement. She stood on the other side of Marin's work table, and she looked at Marin with an expression that was composed and pleasant. And underneath the composure was something that Marin recognized from years of reading human dynamics in ledger entries. A cold, measuring intelligence. "Good morning," Isolde said. "Good morning," Marin said. She did not put down her pen. She did not stand. She was on her own ground in her own room, and she had spent 6 years learning that the best response to the Isoldes of the world was to remain very still and very neutral. "I wanted to speak with you," Isolde said, "about recent events." "I'm not sure what recent events you mean," Marin said, which was a lie, but it was a useful one because it made Isolde work for it. Isolde worked for it without dropping her smile. "You and the king had an encounter in the corridor on Tuesday. It seems to have created some confusion among the pack." "I dropped my documents," Marin said. "He caught my wrist so I wouldn't fall. It was 4 seconds and an apology." "Yes," Isolde said. "The problem is what those 4 seconds left behind." Marin waited. "You're carrying his scent," Isolde said. "I'm sure you know that by now. I'm sure old Voss has come to you with her explanations." A pause. "What you may not fully appreciate is what happens next if this is allowed to develop." "What happens next?" Marin said. "A king cannot mate with a record keeper." She said it gently, the way you said things that were facts rather than opinions, not because of personal feeling. "I have no ill will toward you, Marin, none at all, but because of what this pack requires from its queen. Leadership, alliance, bloodline, the things that hold a pack together in hard years. You know this. You have the history of every mated pair in this hall, in those ledgers. You know what a king's mate is supposed to bring." Marin looked at her. "I'm aware of pack history," she said. "Then you understand that what seems to be forming between you and the king, whatever the bond believes it wants, would destabilize the pack if it were allowed to run its course." A pause, for his sake as much as anyone else's. He needs a partner who can serve beside him, not one who needs to be protected and elevated and managed. The word managed landed with more weight than Isolde likely intended, or perhaps exactly as much weight as she intended. "I appreciate you coming to speak with me directly," Marin said. Her voice was even. She was proud of how even it was. "Was there anything you needed from the records office?" Isolde studied her for a moment. Whatever she was looking for. Capitulation, perhaps, or the visible sign of a woman who understood her place. Marin did not give it to her, not because she was brave, but because she had been keeping her feelings behind her face for a long time, and she was very good at it. Just a conversation, Isolde said pleasantly. She turned and left, and the door closed behind her, and Marin sat in the silence of her record room and breathed slowly and felt the note in her pocket like a weight. Be careful where you walk. She was careful. She was very careful for the next 4 days. She varied her routes through the hall. She went early to meals and left before they became crowded. She kept her interactions brief and professional and gave no one anything to work with. She buried herself in the ledgers with a dedication that would have been impressive under ordinary circumstances and was, under these, essentially a survival strategy. The bond, meanwhile, did what bonds did. It did not ask for her cooperation. It began as a warmth, exactly as Voss had described it, a warmth behind the sternum. And she knew the mechanism now. She understood what it was. And that understanding did nothing at all to diminish it. It was there in the mornings when she woke, a low, radiant heat that had no physical source. It intensified in the afternoons when the hall was at its most active. And she had a theory about why. That he was more present in those hours, moving through the parts of the hall that were near the record room, and that proximity was feeding something that she could not starve by refusing to name it. She caught herself thinking about his hands. She catalogued this thought, observed it with the same neutral efficiency she applied to ledger entries, and went back to work. On the 5th day, she was summoned. The message came through the official steward system, a formal written request delivered by a junior packmate who looked deeply uncomfortable, requesting the record keeper's presence in the Alpha King's private study at the 4th bell of the afternoon. It was signed with the king's seal and contained no other information. She sat with it for a long time. She told herself it was about records. There was a territorial dispute in the northern quarter that had been escalating for weeks and might require historical documentation. There was the question of the succession ledger, which she had been preparing to bring for review. There were any number of legitimate reasons a king might summon his record keeper that had nothing whatsoever to do with a 4-second contact in a corridor and the particular way he had looked at her as he solved an equation. She washed the ink from her hands. She pinned back her hair. She found the set of files she had been preparing for the succession ledger review, and she carried them with her as she walked through the hall toward the private wing. Because carrying documents was armor of a kind. His study was at the far end of the private wing, behind a heavy door that a packmate opened for her without expression. She went in. It was a large room, warmer than the record room by several degrees, and darker. The windows here were west-facing, and the afternoon light came in at a low angle that threw long shadows across the floor. There were shelves of books and territorial maps pinned to boards, and a fire burning in a deep hearth on the far wall. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, and underneath those things, very faintly, something that she was beginning to recognize as his. He was standing by the window when she entered, and he turned when he heard the door, and his face did what it always did, gave her nothing. He looked at the files she was carrying. You brought documents, he said. Succession ledger review, she said. I thought it might be the purpose of the summons. He was quiet for a moment. Sit down, he said. She sat in one of the chairs near the fire, which was not where she had meant to sit. She had meant to remain standing at a professional distance. But when the Alpha King told you to sit, you sat. She put the files on her knees and looked at him. He did not sit. He moved to stand near the fire, not close to her but angled toward her, with his hands clasped behind his back, in the way she had seen him stand at pack assembly. And for a moment he said nothing at all. And she thought about what Voss had said about a warmth and a compulsion toward the other person, and she looked at the fire instead of at him. You know what's been discussed in the pack, he said. Not a question. There has been some talk, she said carefully. I am told it has been more than talk. He paused. Elder Voss came to speak with me this morning. She told me what she believes is forming between us. A longer pause. She was direct about it. She is generally direct, Marin said. It's a quality I respect. Something happened at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, not nearly, but a slight, controlled softening. It was gone before she could be sure she had seen it. She told me you were aware of the bond since Friday afternoon. Yes. You didn't come to me. She looked up at him then. His eyes were on her, dark, careful, and no longer entirely closed off the way they had been in the corridor. It wasn't my place to come to you, she said. The information was. I needed to think about it. And what did you think? She held the files a little tighter. I thought that it was probably not straightforward, that there were reasons it was complicated, that other people would have feelings about it. She hesitated, and that I was sure I was the right person to bring this to your attention, since you are a great deal more invested in the outcome than I am, and I didn't feel it was fair too. You thought you were protecting me, he said. The directness of it surprised her. She looked at him and found him looking back with an expression she had not seen on his face in 6 years of careful observation, which was the expression of someone who had not been considered in a long time and did not quite know what to do with it. I thought I was being practical, she said. Voss said the bond is strong, he said. She said in her 40 years of experience she has not seen a clearer signal. Voss is not infallible, Marin said, which she did not entirely believe but felt was important to say. He looked at her steadily. Do you feel it? The room was very quiet. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the winter afternoon was going dark, and in the study the light had narrowed to a golden warmth that made everything feel closer than it was, and she was aware, with the whole surface of her skin, of precisely how close he was to her, and of the warmth in her sternum that had been building for 5 days and was now, in this room, something she was working hard not to show. Yes, she said. He unclenched his hands from behind his back. It was a small movement, she noticed it. I have been trying, he said slowly, to determine what I feel. I am not. He stopped. Started again. I have spent a long time not allowing certain things. The exercises has become habitual. He looked at the fire. This morning, when Voss came and told me your name and what has been happening in the hall, I realized I had walked past the record room 3 times in 5 days without a reason to be in that corridor. She sat with that for a moment. 3 times, she said. Yes. And did you find what you were looking for? He looked back at her. No, because I didn't know I was looking for anything. A pause. I know now. The words landed in the space between them like stones dropped into still water, and she felt their weight, and she also felt the weight of everything she had been thinking about for 5 days. Isolde's careful voice, the anonymous note, the women in the kitchen, the particular longing of a woman who had made her peace with not being chosen and now found the peace dismantled around her. My lord, she said, I have to be honest with you. I would prefer that, he said. She took a breath. I am aware of what people will say, what some are already saying. I don't have standing in this pack, not real standing. My shift came late. I have no Den family connections. I hold a post that is useful but not prestigious. A king's mate is. She stopped because she could hear Isolde's voice layered under her own words, and that was not who she wanted to be in this room. There will be people who oppose this, she said instead, loudly, and I am not sure that I am, that what I can give you is sufficient to. Stop, he said. She stopped. He crossed the room, and he sat in the chair beside hers, which brought him close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that the bond lit up across her sternum like an ember given oxygen. And she held herself very still. What you just said, he said quietly, is what other people have put in your head. I'm asking what you think. She looked at her hands on the files, at the ink-stained knuckle of her right forefinger, at the plain wool of her skirt. Then she looked up at him, and she said, with the careful honesty of someone who had decided that whatever else happened, she was not going to lie in this room. I think I have been afraid of wanting things for a long time. and that this is the largest thing I have ever wanted, and that frightens me more than anything else." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Yes," and there was something in the word that told her it was not agreement but recognition, that he understood exactly what she meant, not as an abstraction but from the inside. They sat together by the fire for another hour, not touching, talking with a careful and deliberate honesty that felt unlike any conversation she had ever had. And by the time she left the study, she did not know what was going to happen. But she knew that the man who had closed himself down like a house shuttered against winter had just opened a door, and she was on the other side of it. The opposition came swiftly, and it came from above. 3 days after her meeting with the king, Marin was called before the Pack Council, the senior body of Den fathers and elders who governed Pack law and advised the Alpha King on matters of policy and succession. The summons was more formal than Isolde's visit, but carried the same essential message in a larger frame. There were 7 of them seated at the long council table when she entered, and she knew all their faces from the records she had kept. The births of their children, the deaths of their parents, the land claims and disputes and alliance agreements that made up the texture of their long lives in the pack. She had been invisible to them in the way that the person who kept the record was always invisible. A function rather than a presence. And now they were looking at her with the full weight of their collective attention, and she felt the record room very far away. Den Father Var sat at the center of the table. He was Isolde's father, a broad, silver-haired man with the particular authority of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in most rooms. He was not unkind. He was simply certain. "Record keeper," he said, "thank you for coming." She stood without being offered a chair and made a note of that. "Of course," she said. "You understand why we've asked to speak with you," he said. "I have a sense," she said. Var laced his fingers on the table. "What is forming between you and the Alpha King has been the subject of significant discussion among the council. We are not dismissing the reality of the bond. The bond is law in our tradition, and we do not contravene it lightly." He paused. "But the bond requires mutual acknowledgement and completion to become binding. It is not yet complete." "I'm aware," she said. "Then you'll understand our position." He met her eyes. "The Alpha King has served this pack alone for 11 years. He has delayed choosing a mate for reasons we have respected, because his judgment on his own heart is his own. But the pack requires stability. The pack requires a succession line, a mated queen, alliances that a strong mating provides." Another pause. "A record keeper, whatever her personal qualities, cannot provide those things." She kept her hands still at her sides. "May I ask a question?" Var nodded. "In the histories I maintain," she said, "there are 4 documented cases over the past 200 years in which a fated mate bond was formally challenged by Pack Council. In 3 of those cases, the challenge failed. The wolves involved completed their bond regardless of council opposition, and in each of those cases, the pack stabilized within 2 seasons." She paused. "In the 4th case, the challenge succeeded. The fated pair was separated. The alpha in that case died without completing the bond, unmarked, 14 months later. His pack dissolved within a generation." She kept her voice very even. "I have those records, if the council would like to review them." The table was silent. She had not known she was going to say that until she said it. She had known the histories. She knew all the histories, but she had not planned to deploy them. Something about being offered a chair and then not being offered a chair had made her decide that neutrality was no longer the right armor. Var looked at her for a long moment. His expression had not changed, but something behind it had shifted. "That is a particular point of view on those histories," he said. "It's what the records say," she said. "I keep the records." She left the council chamber and went back to the record room and sat down and shook, quietly, for about 5 minutes. Then she made herself tea and went back to work. The king came to her that evening. Not through formal summons this time. He simply appeared in her doorway at the 7th bell. When the hall was going quiet, and the record room was lit only by the 2 lamps she kept burning for evening work, she heard the step and looked up, and there he was, still in his formal clothes from whatever his day had required of him, looking at her across the length of the room, with an expression she was beginning to learn to read. "I heard you went before the council," he said. "They invited me," she said. He came into the room. He moved to the shelves and looked at the ledgers the way she had seen visitors sometimes do, not reading the titles but touching the spines, a kind of orientation. "What did you say?" "I cited historical precedent," she said. "I told them what the records show about fated bond challenges." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And you're not frightened?" She thought about her 5 minutes of shaking. "I didn't say that." He turned from the shelves. He looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked back. And the bond was a steady warmth between them now. Not the sharp flare of proximity, but something deeper and more settled. Something that had been building for 8 days and was no longer politely pretending it wasn't there. "The council cannot stop this," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know pack law," she said. "The council advises. It doesn't command." "No." He moved to stand beside the table. He was close enough now that the warmth of him was real, physical warmth, overlaid with the wood smoke and leather of his study. "But I wanted you to know that it was not merely my obligation, that my willingness to hold the council's opposition is not reluctant." She looked up at him. There was something in his face she had not seen before, not in 6 years of careful observation, a vulnerability so controlled that it barely existed, as thin as the finest paper in her archive, but visible if you knew how to look. "You're not very practiced at saying things you want to say," she said gently. His jaw tightened, the tiniest contraction. "No," he said, "I'm not." "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. Why are you here tonight?" "You could have sent word through Ryan." "You could have. This is not the official path." A king coming to the record room at the 7th bell. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because I walked past this corridor 3 times this week before I understood why. Tonight I understood why, and I decided not to pretend I was going somewhere else." She held his gaze. The lamplight between them was warm and soft, and the hall was quiet around them, and the bond in her chest was a full and steady thing, and she said, "I'm glad you came." He reached out and his hand found hers on the table, not catching her wrist this time. Not a reflex, but deliberate, his fingers wrapping around hers in the still lamplight. She felt the contact move through her like a chord struck on a bell, clean and resonant and total. And she heard his breath change, just slightly, and she thought, he feels it too. He feels exactly this. They stood like that for a moment that was not long in time, but would stay with her for the rest of her life. "I have things to do tomorrow," he said, "that are not going to be easy." "I know," she said. "I need you to trust that I know what this costs," he said, "and that I think it's worth it. Not because the bond compels me, but because—" He stopped. The vulnerability on his face was paper thin and real. "You spoke to the council the way I used to wish my advisors would speak to me, without deference, with the actual truth." "It's habit," she said. "I work with facts." "I know," he said. "I need someone who works with facts." He looked at their joined hands. "I have been surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear for 11 years. Do you know how exhausting that is?" "No," she said honestly, "but I can imagine." He almost smiled. She watched it happen. The slow, reluctant, genuine, almost smile of a man who had not done it in a long time and was slightly surprised by the feeling. "Of course you can," he said. "You've read all the records." She laughed, a real one, small and sudden, and she felt the surprise of it herself, the way laughter arrived sometimes when you'd been holding your breath for a long time. And he looked at her when she laughed with something that she recognized. Finally, as what other people looked like when they were looking at the person they loved. She knew the look because she had been recording it in ledgers for 6 years. She had just never expected to see it directed at her. He went back to the private wing that evening without resolving anything formally, without declaration or ceremony, but with her hand in his at the record room table, and a conversation that had gone past the space between their stations and into the space between who they actually were. And the next morning, she woke with the warmth in her chest, so bright and constant that for a moment she could not breathe. What happened next was not the story she had been telling herself. She had been expecting it to come slowly, to be negotiated in careful, formal steps through the council and the pack hierarchy and the weight of tradition. And she had been steeling herself for the long middle distance of that process, for the weeks of careful positioning and quiet resistance that she had been accumulating armor for. It did not come slowly. It came on a Wednesday morning in the great hall at pack assembly. She was not supposed to be there, or rather, she was, because the record keeper attended all pack assemblies as a matter of function, to keep the official register of decisions and declarations made in the assembly. She sat at the recorder's table to the left of the main dais, which she had done at every assembly for 4 years, invisible in plain sight, ink and ledger, and the running notation of pack business. The assembly had been called to address the Northern Territorial dispute, which was its stated purpose. And for the first 20 minutes, it's exactly that. 3 Den families presenting claims, the king asking questions from the high chair at the center of the dais, Braith providing historical context from prepared notes that were significantly less comprehensive than what Marin had in her ledgers. But she said nothing, because it was not her role to speak unless asked. Den Father Var changed the agenda. He rose from his seat among the senior council, and he addressed the assembly not about the territorial dispute, but about the matter of the king's mate. And he did it without preamble, framing it as a matter of pack security and the succession, and in the space of 3 minutes, he made a formal council recommendation that the Alpha King be asked to formally disavow the forming bond and proceed with the selection of a mate from among the ranked wolf families within the pack. He did it in front of everyone, all 300 packmates who attended assembly, every face in the great hall. He did it while looking at Marin. She did not move. She kept her pen on the paper. She wrote down what he said, every word, in the neat, careful hand of a woman who recorded pack history for a living. And she felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes move from Var to her and back again. And she kept her face composed and still, and she thought, so this is the forced exposure. This is the turning point. The hall waited. She did not look at Kaelin. She kept her eyes on the page, writing, and she heard the silence of the assembly. 300 wolves gone absolutely still, and she heard, in that silence, the quality of the wait. They were not waiting to see what Den Father Var would say next. They were waiting to see what the king would do. He rose from the high chair. He did not do it quickly or with drama. He rose the way stones moved, without hurry, with absolute certainty. He stood at the full height of him, which was considerable, and he looked out over the assembly with the dark, careful eyes that she had catalogued from a distance for 6 years and had come to understand, in the past 10 days, were not cold but controlled, which was a different thing entirely. Den Father Var has made a recommendation, he said. His voice carried without effort, the way it always did, moving through the great hall like water through a channel. I will address it. She kept writing. I will not disavow the bond, he said. The hall exhaled. She felt it, the collective release of held breath, 300 wolves sighing. There are people in this pack, he continued, who have understood something for the past 10 days that I was slow to recognize. I am informed of that, and I will not pretend otherwise. A pause. The record keeper, Marin Ashby, is fated to me. This is not something I am willing to dispute, set aside, or manage on behalf of political convenience. She was writing. Her hand was steady. She was very proud of her hand. There have been arguments made about status and standing, he said, about what a king's mate is supposed to provide. Those arguments come from people who have the pack's interests genuinely at heart, and I do not dismiss them lightly. He looked over the hall, and she knew, without looking up, that his gaze was moving toward her. She could feel it like sunlight. But I want to tell you what this Pixpax record keeper has given it. She has maintained your histories with absolute fidelity for 6 years. She has recorded every death and birth and mating with the same care. She knows this pack, its bloodlines, its disputes, its alliances, its grief, the way no one else in this hall knows it, because she has spent 6 years paying careful attention to every one of you and writing it down and keeping it safe. She had stopped writing. She was not aware of having stopped. She became aware of it now, the pen still in her hand, the page half empty, the hall completely silent. I do not need a mate who brings alliance, he said. I need a mate who brings truth, who will speak to me without deference, who works with facts and is not afraid of them. He paused. I spent 11 years closing myself against the world because the world had cost me things I did not recover from. She is the first person in 11 years who spoke to me like a person rather than a king. That is not a small thing. That is not something I am willing to set aside. He looked at her then, directly, openly, in front of the entire pack, with the expression she had seen in the lamplight of the record room the week before. The one she had recognized from 6 years of mating ledgers, the particular look of someone who had found the specific person they needed. Marin, he said, I am asking you in front of this pack to complete the bond, not because the bond compels it, because I want it, because you have been the truest thing in this hall since the moment I stood up from the floor of that corridor and thought about you for 5 days before I understood why. She looked up at him. 300 wolves waited. She was a record keeper, a woman whose station sat below the salt at the great table, a late shifting wolf with ink on her fingers and a room full of other people's histories. And she had spent 6 years making herself invisible. And she looked at him across the great hall with the bond blazing warm and certain in her chest, and she thought, I could say nothing. I could keep my head down and wait for this to resolve itself in an official channel and be dignified and careful and invisible. She thought about Isolde's pleasant voice. She thought about the council table and the chair she had not been offered. She thought about the note slid under her door. She thought about 4 seconds in a corridor and a hand on her wrist and what had followed from it. 10 days of knowledge and longing, and the best conversation of her life in a room full of lamplight and old ledgers. She stood up. It was not a dramatic gesture. She simply stopped sitting and stood, and she moved out from behind the recorder's table, and she walked across the great hall toward the dais, and the crowd parted the way. Crowds parted for the Alpha King, which was a thing she had never experienced before, and which felt like the world reconfiguring itself around her. And she reached the foot of the dais, and she looked up at him. I should note for the records, she had said clearly enough that the hall could hear, that I have no significant bloodline, no ranked family connections, and that my wolf came late. She paused. I also have the complete territorial history of the Ashvale Pack, going back 240 years, and the formal records of every succession, every alliance, and every mated pair in that history. I know this pack. I know its law and its grief and its agreements, and I know that it has survived its hardest years, not because its leaders chose the most prestigious mates, but because they chose the truest ones. A pause. I choose to complete the bond, she said. If the king is certain, how could I not be certain? He said, quiet enough that it was almost only for her. How could I look at any of this, at who you are, and not be certain? He came down from the dais and he took her face in his hands, the same hands that had caught her wrist in the corridor 10 days ago, warm through the wool then, and warm against her skin now, and he pressed his forehead to hers, which was the old gesture. The pack's oldest gesture of formal claiming, older than ceremony, older than law, and she felt the bond complete itself between them like a door swung open on its hinges, sudden and total, the warmth in her chest expanding until it was no longer a warmth behind the sternum, but something that lived in the whole of her, cellular and certain and irrevocable. The hall did not erupt in celebration immediately. There was a moment, brief, significant, of absolute silence, the kind of silence that followed something real, something that could not be walked back. Then old Voss, from her seat among the elders, began to clap. It was a measured, deliberate sound in the quiet, and it was joined by others, slowly and then all at once. And the great hall of the Ashvale pack filled with the sound of 300 wolves, acknowledging what had always been true. Den Father Var sat down. He did not clap, but he did not leave either. And she thought that was probably the closest thing to acceptance she was likely to get from him in the near term. And she was prepared to live with that. The official bond completion, the formal ceremony, the marking, the mating seal entered into the pack's register. Happened 3 days later, in the private wing chapel, attended by Elder Voss and 2 pack witnesses and no one else, by Marin's request and Kaelin's agreement. She had attended enough mating ceremonies in her professional capacity to know that the formal witnessing could be large or small, and that what made a bond was not the ceremony, but the thing itself, which had already happened in front of 300 wolves in the great hall. She wore her regular dress, the gray wool that smelled of ink, which she had laundered and pressed for the occasion. She had nothing else that she felt was truly hers, and she thought it mattered, at the moment of her own marking, to be dressed in herself. He marked her on the left shoulder, which was the traditional site, and the pain of it was brief and warm, and then not pain at all, but a steady, deep heat that settled into her bones and did not leave. She marked him in return. The reciprocal mark, which was not always done, but which she had read about in the oldest ledgers, the ones that predated the current pack conventions, and which meant something that the current conventions had almost forgotten. The bond flows both ways. The queen is not the king's, they are each other's. When it was done, they sat together in the small chapel in the pale winter light, and he held her hand with the care of a man who had been careful with his hands for a long time, and was only now beginning to understand what they were for. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The record room," she said. "I want to keep it. I want to keep the work." He looked at her. "You thought I would take it from you. I thought it might be complicated, politically. A queen who keeps the records herself." "A queen who keeps the records herself," he said, slowly, turning the phrase over, "is perhaps exactly what a pack that has survived on its histories needs." A pause. "Besides," he said, with the almost smile she was learning to wait for, "you know where everything is. It would be deeply impractical to change the system now." She laughed, and he smiled, fully and genuinely. And she thought that she would record this moment too, not in the official ledgers, but in the private one she had kept since her first year in the hall, the small leather book in which she had written down the moments that seemed worth keeping. This would go on the first page of a new chapter. The day the Alpha King smiled in the winter light of the chapel, and it felt like a door opened in a house that had been shuttered for 11 years, and all the cold, dark rooms began slowly, steadily to warm. In the weeks that followed, the pack adjusted, the way packs did, not all at once, not without friction, but steadily. There were people who remained doubtful, people who watched her with the careful eyes of those waiting for the new queen to prove herself. And she understood that and did not mind it, because she had something they did not expect her to have. The histories. She knew every family, every alliance, every wound and ambition and grief in the Asheville pack, because she had spent 6 years writing it all down, and that knowledge, which had seemed like the private armor of a woman making herself useful, turned out to be exactly the foundation a queen needed. She kept the record room. She continued the work, the births, the deaths, the land claims, the mating registers, and she added to it the official records of the crown. The documents that had previously passed through a chain of advisors before being properly archived and had consequently developed a number of significant gaps in their continuity. She filled the gaps. She was very good at filling gaps, Isolde Var left the hall in the spring to take up a position as den mother in the Western Quarter, which was a role with genuine dignity and genuine purpose, and Marin wished her well in it without irony. She made a note in the official register of Isolde's new appointment with the same careful hand she brought to everything, and felt no need to make it anything other than what it was. Den Father Var presented a formal gift to the new queen at the spring assembly. A bound copy of the Pact's founding documents, beautifully made, which was a significant gesture, and which she received with the same composed neutrality she had brought to the council chamber, and then thanked him specifically for the historical record it contained, which was her way of letting him know she had read everything and understood everything, and was not going to hold any of it against him. He looked at her for a long moment after that, and she thought she saw, in the careful old face, the beginning of a reassessment. Old Voss came to the record room in the early weeks, as she had always come, to consult the registers, and they worked together in a comfortable quiet that felt to Marin like the specific pleasure of a partnership with no posturing in it. And once Voss looked up from a ledger she was reviewing and said, without particular prelude, "You know, I knew the moment I saw his scent on you." "Everyone knew," Marin said, "except us." "That is generally how it works," Voss said, with the dry satisfaction of a woman who had been right about things for 8 decades. "The ones it belongs to are always the last to understand it." Marin thought about Tuesday morning in the corridor, the scattered documents and the 4-second contact, and the warmth that had followed her to sleep. She thought about the 5 days of not understanding, and the weeks of careful maneuvering, and the great hall, and 300 wolves and a man coming down from a dais, with his face open for the first time in 11 years. Not so last, she said, eventually. Kaylin came to the record room most evenings now, which was a development that the hall had absorbed with varying degrees of bemused acceptance. The sight of the Alpha King in the doorway of the East Wing's least prestigious room, coat off, seated across from his queen at the long central table, with a cup of cooling tea and a territorial map he was using as an excuse to be somewhere other than his study. He was not always talking. Sometimes he sat in the lamplight while she worked, reading through reports or simply being present, and she had discovered that he was very good at silence, comfortable in it, not filling it out of habit, which was a quality she had not expected and valued more than she could easily say. One evening in late winter, close to the end of the season, he looked up from the map he had ostensibly been reviewing and said, "You still have ink on your face." She touched her cheek. "I always have ink on my face." "Yes," he said, and the almost smile was all the way there, complete and unguarded. The smile of a man who had been a stone wall for a long time and had begun, slowly, to believe that warmth was not a weakness he could not afford. "It's one of the facts I'm learning to work with." She looked at him across the lamplit table, this serious and careful and thoroughly unsimple man who had stopped in a corridor without knowing why, and walked past her door 3 times without admitting what he was looking for. And she thought that the bond had not made a mistake, and she had been wrong to think it might, and that the Pact's histories were full of fated pairs who had found each other against improbable odds, and that she had recorded every one of those stories with her careful ink-stained hand, and had never once imagined she would be in the record herself. She picked up her pen. She opened the small private ledger to the new chapter. She wrote down the date and the quality of the lamplight and the way he was looking at her, and she thought, "This is what I know how to do. I keep the record. I hold the history. I make sure the true things are written down so they cannot be lost." She wrote. He stopped in the corridor, and everyone in the pack knew what it meant before either of them did, and what they could not have known was that the woman with ink on her hands and history in her ledgers was exactly the thing the Stone King had been shuttered against the cold without. And that when the door finally opened, it did not matter at all, that no one had thought to give her a chair at the council table, because she had already been keeping the record all along. And the record, as it turned out, had been keeping her.